Firstly, just to say thank you to everyone for beating the cold and coming to join us this afternoon. I am both excited and nervous to be standing in front of you. It's over a year since I've engaged with people face to face. I'm normally talking in front of a screen. So it's relatively new for me to be talking to people face to face. Just before we start, just a bit of kind of housekeeping. Can I just kind of ask that when we're in the venue to ensure that we are wearing our mask? I know we're also trying to sip our wine and having our kind of plays, but if you want to take off your mask, you can do that outside, that'll be great. There are toilets just around the corner of this building. It's kind of tucked into the wall in an architecturally designed way. And also the hashtag for today event is hashtag futures and beyond. So if you want to tweet some of the research findings and all of that, feel free to tweet. By way of introduction, my name is Lonwabo Mabuso from Andani.Africa. So today we've come here to present the research findings out of a project that we did with UJ, University of Johannesburg, Arts and Culture, partnered with, UJ partnered with Andani in organizing Futures and Beyond, which happened in March this year. And Futures and Beyond essentially was a forum that started to bring together practitioners within, sorry, it's so hard speaking with a mask on. It's a project that brought in, a project that brought in creatives from across the continent to talk about creatives and also tech people within 4IR to talk about the intersections between creative industries and 4IR technologies on the continent. And so this research was commissioned by University of Johannesburg Arts and Culture to see how these two worlds collide. So today, essentially, we'll be presenting this research. Just to give you a bit of a sense how today is going to run. So we're going to have an introductory video by Peter Jacobs, the head of Arts and Culture for UJ. And then Molemo Moila will present the research findings. Because of COVID regulation, we decided not to have Q&A sessions. So after the sessions, please stick around for us to further engage with some of the findings from this research. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jade to play the introduction from Peter.
Good afternoon. I'm Peter Jacobs, Head of Arts and Culture at the University of Johannesburg. In these interesting times, joining you virtually should not be strange at all anymore, and perhaps it is especially fitting for an event that centers around the fourth industrial revolution, technology, and creativity. Despite the growing awareness of how the fourth industrial revolution will transform the creative industries, we've become acutely aware of the limited engagement and discourse around this topic in both South Africa and on the continent. And yet the faster technological integration occurs, the more pressing our need becomes for knowledge production on this subject. With Professor Tsilitsi Marwala at the helm of the university, it has become synonymous with 4IR, and it is therefore fitting for the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture to champion this discourse. Through the global outbreak of COVID-19, we have seen how rapidly humanity was forced to further integrate technology on a macro and micro scale. In some instances, artists and creatives utilized digital platforms with limited success, and while we are able to adopt learnings from across the world to develop a successful strategy for the production of literature on 4IR that would be useful for us, we must frame our research findings through an African lens. There might be global commonalities, but contextually, our way forward must cater for and address our continent and country's particular challenges. The aim of Futures and Beyond Forum presented earlier this year was to provide a platform for critical and robust discourse around the integration of arts and technology. In 2022, UJ Arts and Culture will move this conversation forward with an accredited conference planned for the first quarter. The next Futures and Beyond is planned to be a hybrid event, strengthening relationship between academia and industry to the benefit of society at large. Thank you for joining us this afternoon as we summarize the findings of the forum that took place in March, and we look forward to seeing you again next year. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, virtually. And now I'm going to introduce Molemo to take us through the research. Molemo is the director at Andani.Africa and also head of research. Just maybe to give you a little bit of context around Andani. Andani is a research and insights company. We've been around for about 5 years, and our work is really about kind of doing research in the creative economy and understanding how the creative economy grows and develops within the context of the continent. And we've worked on various projects in South Africa, but also in the rest of the continent. So, Molemo, please, over to you.
Thanks, Lonabo. Hello, everybody. You probably can't tell, but I'm smiling at you all. I'm gonna try the mask. If it doesn't work, I might drop it. So thank you, everybody, for being here. As Lonabo's already mentioned, the idea is really to present some of the research findings to you. It's ended up maybe a slightly overdeveloped research report. It's about 30 or 40 pages long. So I'm really going to be pulling out some of the kind of key points that I think are maybe some of the things that I found the most interesting to share with you. And are really oriented towards trying to think what it means to bring creative industries and the fourth industrial revolution together. Now, I told you that I needed to practice or it wouldn't work. Shout when I should. Point there. I know. Nope. Okay, I'm gonna. Cool. So within the creative industries, but I think more broadly, this term 4IR is seen as a bit of a buzzword, with a bit of eye rolling sometimes, and yet at the same time does feel like something quite urgent and quite sort of immediate to our moment. And there is always this concern of how do we engage with the change that is happening already and the change that's coming. And from the perspective of kind of creativity, we talk about the creative industries, which for those of you who come maybe not from that background, usually refers to your film, dance, theatre kinds of fields, but also your architecture, your advertising, are generally referred to the creative industries. But we, and in fact, partly informed by the South African Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, we're informed by the idea of creative economy, which is this idea that talks about how the ways in which the creative industries is actually moving beyond just this circle of people who do these creative things, but also operates in many other fields and operates in the broader economy. The easiest example of this would be advertising, for example. And even though there might be some kind of sense that these two things are quite different, the people who work on stage in a theatre acting are very different to the people who are behind computers, part of what we are really interested in is really talking about how the fact that the creative industries and technology have always grown together and that we've always made each other stronger. And so partly what I'm going to be talking about today is that kind of conversation. But it's also a bit of a kind of position paper, looking to kind of explore, experiment with what a future of creative industries and fourth industrial revolution might look like, noting from the past that creative industries and technology have always operated together. What might this future kind of operate as? And what we've had to do is take research from multiple different kinds of spaces, things that aren't always connecting, and try and connect them. So it's quite a kind of experimental conversation that really tries to enable a conversation that, even though, as I think Peter mentioned, is happening globally, it's not happening in much detail. We're interested in the connection of these two things, but it's not really being spoken about in very sort of fixed and practical ways. So that's what we've tried to kind of explore. So as I mentioned, we're really interested in the fact that technology and the arts have always kind of grown together. And as a very brief run through, of course, the first industrial revolution is brought about primarily by this technological invention of steam. And at the time of this, you have things like the steam engine, which is what the first industrial revolution is associated with. But you also have major industrialization of some creative industries. So creative industries become strongly impacted by this moment. And the loom, and particularly the printing press, is a major moment in a kind of shift in mass printing in the first industrial revolution. And if you think about kind of what's then happened to text in the way that we engage in the world ever since then, And anytime you look at your laptop or your cell phone, I mean, that's the kind of extended history of the printing press. In the second industrial revolution, that's kind of generally associated with the invention of electricity and then mechanization. And at the same time, you have the invention of photography. Again, you see this kind of connection between a technological invention, which in fact creates a technological invention within creative industries. Again, photography remains part of the life of technology. Today, the best phones are the ones that take the best pictures. The third industrial revolution, similarly, kind of based on computers and the microchip and the internet, and has a huge impact on the creative industries, opens up a whole new world of the kinds of creative practice we can make. But creative industries is also then inputting back into how technology operates. And a really nice example is just graphic interface. This is what the technologists started. And none of us would have stayed here. None of us would have been using computers the way we did if we stayed here, right? And many technologists still operate in this space, I've learned. But most of us are operating in that space, and aren't we grateful for it? And of course, that's the relationship between creatives and technology, and creative technology that has always existed. So today we find ourselves in this kind of space where we're moving into the fourth industrial revolution, which is this idea that we're now in a space where technology is just so incorporated into every element of our lives. And so the question becomes, okay, we've always been together, we've always enabled each other, what happens next? One of the big questions that happens, that often comes up around the fourth industrial revolution is the robots are going to take over your jobs question. And of course, this is a question that's come up quite a lot in the creative industries as well. And there's some really interesting things to learn from global sort of stats and ideas in relation to this. So for many people looking at the fourth industrial revolution, there are three key priorities. And the creative industries is interesting in the first one around upskilling, and in the third one around so-called soft skills. I know there are some people who don't, I think Beth is anti the word soft in relation to that. So one of the things is that creatives have pointed out to be really agile digital adopters. The creative industries is an industry where people generally learn on the job. We have a very low level of entry. In many industries, such as things like film, it's very easy to come in without very established skills, even without a matric, and to then learn skills on the job. And internationally, this is the case where most of us are learning our digital skills in the workplace through peer review, through kind of peer engagement, peer learning, and self-teaching, which is, of course, a major part of what it's going to mean to upskill. And there is the issue of like large-scale formal upskilling, but there's also this term that comes about in relation to the fourth industrial revolution, which is about lifelong learning, which is about this ability to kind of explore and self-train and kind of grow your own skills capacity within the workplace. This said, a lot of people in the creative industries have identified the fourth industrial revolution type skills, which I'll talk about a bit more, but it's things like your VR, your IR, your Internet of Things, those kinds of things that come to determine this word, as really important for advancing their careers. And a number of creative industries companies have also identified that their clients are asking for some of these capacities, but they don't have them. And there is the kind of interest and need to grow those skills and develop those skills. At the same time, creativity has been identified as a primary skill by the World Economic Forum, who kind of invented the word fourth industrial revolution, as a primary skill within the creative industries. And this is within this idea of soft skills, which is that as technologies advance, as technologies become easy to build, as they change society, we're going to need to be able to understand and relate to being human in much more complex, much more sophisticated ways. We're also going to need to relate to things like innovation, and creativity is a huge part of that. But even though this gets repeated a lot when you Google creativity and fourth industrial revolution, what that looks like is quite a difficult question for a lot of us, and I think is the future of how that's going to be developed, both from the perspective of tech, people from the tech backgrounds who know that there's going to be a need for increased innovation, for increased development of intellectual property, which I'll also talk about just now, but also from creatives who are needing to kind of understand how we fit in this world and what we can contribute to this world, which I think is quite an exciting space. In terms of our own kind of capacity within the creative industries, World Economic Forum has done some research, for example, around the media and entertainment industry. And these are the kinds of skills that they identify as the kinds of skills that are needed for an industry to move into the fourth industrial revolution. And interestingly, you see right at the end, the purple is the media and entertainment industry, and the kind of pinkish is the general average in all industries in the economy globally. And interestingly, on the last one, you'll see that the media and entertainment industry is actually perceived to be relatively strong in terms of skills capacity in relation to industry more broadly. So actually, in terms of technical capacity and technical skills, a lot of our industry is quite far ahead. And the things that come to mind are things like Netflix, are things like YouTube, which have pushed kind of algorithmic understanding, have like really shifted the way we think about data. And so there's actually quite a lot of technical skill within the creative industries to some degree. And then of course, social skills, which is again, this idea of soft skills. But then there's some interesting ones, like for example, problem solving skills, which in my humble opinion, I couldn't find any data to back me up, is actually a really strong capacity within the creative industries. We are problem solvers. But the ways in which problem solving is understood in a, say, tech or engineering sort of perspective is very different. And how do creatives start to think about the ways in which we apply our particular approach to problem solving in the kind of tech idea? And how do sort of the tech world start to understand that we have something to offer in that sort of arena? Another area, of course, is this idea of gig working. We all know about some of the challenges around, say, Uber, and the fact that so many workers are increasingly being pushed out of formal labor. And here's another space where the tech world and the creative world have something in common. We have some of the highest freelancer numbers in our industries globally. And we know, of course, in the creative industries, what this can mean in terms of precarity, particularly since being hit by the pandemic, the kinds of impacts it means to have freelance work. But on the other hand, freelance work is seen to be increasing within the fourth industrial revolution, partly because very specific skills are going to be needed to be applied and then removed, and then applied and then removed. This idea of someone who kind of works through a company over 50 years and increases their kind of job title within a company, that kind of is leaving. And people are needing very particular skills to plug in at certain points. And that's something that we're very familiar with in the creative industries. So on the one hand, we have quite a good understanding of how you kind of operate the freelance space, and have a kind of strength in this arena as this shifts in future. On the other hand, we also know that we haven't been particularly good at supporting and protecting freelance workers. And there's potential with the fourth industrial revolution and how things shift to really drive a conversation that enables much more protection for freelance and gig workers. But then the question becomes, okay, that's all great internationally. And interestingly, there's not a lot of data around skills in the workplace and digital skills in South Africa or the African context. And this is something we're really excited to move forward and looking at after this project. That's kind of the new project that we're working on. So we're having to rely on international data for thinking about digital skills, particularly for the creative industries. But there is always this question, okay, what does that mean in this context? And for us, one of the things that became really, really clear, particularly during the forum that was held during March, is the fact that Africa is still in the third industrial revolution and is moving into the fourth industrial revolution. And that any kind of response to thinking about the fourth industrial revolution has to address the limitations of the third, or the limitations of Africa's engagement with the third. And this is not, I don't think that this is a kind of problem or concern. I think it's a reality and a space that for many people, some of who are in this room, who are engaging with things like digital access, things like data must fall, this is a really important question, and any conversation about so-called 4IR needs to start with the issue of access to digital. That said, Africa is also kind of very digital and connected. So this first one is 96% is the worldwide mobile penetration average. The continent's average is actually 95%. It's not very behind. And Southern Africa leads the world with 169% because people have more than one phone. With mobile money, we also lead the world. We have, as a continent, 500 billion users of mobile money across Africa, and about $500 billion moving around on our cell phones. And in fact, the next biggest mobile money economy is Asia, and we are 3.5 times bigger than them. So in some ways, if you go to places like Kenya or Zimbabwe, and there's a gogo who sells like mealies on the corner and she uses mobile money, we have a hyper-digitized kind of element to some of our work. And yet at the same time, we also have the lowest average internet connectivity, and some parts of our continent only have 25% access. And just basic things like electricity, which is the second industrial revolution, can be incredibly difficult for our continent. So we're really facing substantial challenges. And so when you look at these challenges, you kind of think, hey, slow down, why are we talking about the fourth industrial revolution? There's some things we need to fix. The World Economic Forum has a kind of set of metrics by which they measure readiness for the fourth industrial revolution. And we're the green ones, right there at the back. There's one green one there in the high potential area, which of course is South Africa. But generally the continent is in what's called the nascent area. Possibility, but not much moving. But at the same time, the fourth industrial revolution, as we might name it, is moving forward. There's mass kind of investment in fourth industrial revolution technologies, major kind of look at data on the continent. We're a continent that doesn't have very accessible data and is kind of seen as the future space of investment. And you have a lot of internationals investing in developing these kinds of technologies on the African continent in order to access economy on the African continent. So if we're kind of feeling like we're a bit behind, but at the same time things are speeding ahead, what do we do with this kind of situation becomes the question, I think. And what we're interested in is what role does the creative industries play in that very particular South African sort of context, or African context. So through the research that we've done and through speaking to a range of really interesting people working in this kind of field, many of you are in this room, and through the forum in particular, a number of key sort of ideas have come forward. And the first is this idea of audacity. And if I might quote Nyari Samushonga, she said just last week, the R in 4IR is meant to mean revolution. What is revolutionary about what we're doing? And what Emmanuel Gamo had really brought forward in the forum that we held was this idea of audacity. To what degree are we really taking things with both hands and pushing forward? And of course, this can feel quite challenging in the space of some of the limitations that the continent faces. But for many people who are engaging with this topic, one of the first things that becomes necessary is for Africans to actually take charge of our digital futures and to determine digital futures according to our own kind of cultural and historical terms. And that also means very specifically using digital futures to respond to our colonial histories and our current contemporary issues with inequality. And so that becomes a kind of first step for many people who are engaging in this area. The second is this idea of humanism, and the Vice Chancellor of UJ, Professor Marwala, who opened the forum in March and who's written many books, etc., really speaks to this. We also had another speaker, Sabelo Mhlambi, who's a Harvard-based academic who's really interested in thinking through Ubuntu to really challenge the ways in which technology is being created in the world. From the perspective of kind of very capitalist position, but also from a perspective that is just really not dealing with some of the really, really human issues that need to be addressed. So this becomes another sort of foundational element. And where those two can maybe feel a bit abstract, but are also very necessary, and I'll speak to a practical example just now, I promise. The third one is also really interesting, which is this possibility of ideas. And this is actually something that emerges from what's already happening on the African continent, which is there are actually some very leading, sort of world-leading technologies emerging out of the continent that respond to our context and often respond to relatively limited technological capacity. So we have the potential to create technologies that respond to limited resources, that are not trying to do, but the biggest 3D printer in the world, which is in South Africa, in case you didn't know. So not trying to do the best technology, but really coming up with the best ideas to solve problems. And this is really interesting because it also relates to the question of where value is going to live in the fourth industrial revolution. And for some thinkers, because technology is going to be moving so quickly, because it'll become cheaper and easier to create, hardware and even software are going to be relatively sort of malleable spaces of value. They're going to move very quickly. You're going to create an app and it's going to be dead in a couple of months. Nobody's going to be interested in it. But ideas become the space that value is possible, and intellectual property becomes the space that value is possible. So we're moving away from value in manufacturing and much more to value in ideas and intellectual property. So for example, China is trying to move its kind of national brand from made in China to designed in China. And that word designed is interesting because that word designed comes from the creative industries, and again is this idea of creation, of creativity, of innovation, and of intellectual property specifically from that. So in the report, we cover kind of some examples of how these ideas play out across multiple different kinds of technologies that are considered fourth industrial revolution technologies. But I'm going to speak to one in particular that I think is quite interesting, which is the idea of smart contracts and blockchain, which at the moment is a technology that hasn't really fulfilled its full fruition. We haven't quite got there globally yet. And many of you probably would have heard of NFTs, the non-fungible tokens, which are these digital artworks that are being sold for bajillions. And that's the same kind of technology, but even though they're being sold for a lot of money, that technology hasn't actually reached its full fruition yet. And this technology is really interesting in how it relates to intellectual property. So effectively, it has the potential to build intellectual property and thus intellectual property payments into the process of, for example, playing a song. So in those NFT works that are going for very expensive, those are digital artworks, but there's a lot of potential, for example, in music as well. And this is particularly interesting, and I just realized I'm not going to be able to trick you if you read that slide. Oh well, let's see. So these are the top 10 countries in Africa in terms of getting rights for music being replayed. So that's your kind of copyright, your needle rights. So this is music being played all over the world, and a rights organization, for those of you who aren't so familiar with this, will collect money every time your song is played somewhere. And these are the top 10 countries. Which country is missing?
Nigeria.
Didn't manage to trick you. So for those of you who are relatively familiar, anyway, you probably would have spotted it because Nigeria is probably one of the biggest, and certainly the internationally, the biggest music sort of scene on the continent. And yet they're not in the top 10 of rights collection on the continent. Mauritius collects more money from music than Nigeria. Hope there's no one from Mauritius. Does anybody want to try and guess why?
Formal economies?
So they hadn't set up a rights collecting agency until 2008.
Sure.
And then in 2018, the main rights collection agency was, their license was suspended due to governance issues, and it's still suspended.
Sure.
So formalization of creative industries is the primary issue. So there's nobody in, there's only recently somebody in Nigeria collecting money on behalf of Nigerian artists. I tried to find out how Burna Boy does this.
Yeah.
My guess is that he's registered in the US. I couldn't find any information about it. But what that means, so if you look, for example, at the biggest streamed artist on something like Spotify or on YouTube, and all these stats are in there, but I can't remember them off by heart. I know on YouTube, of the kind of top 15, the top 8 in terms of international plays are all Nigerian. So there's a lot of money there, but it's not going to Nigeria. All of Burna Boy's money and all the rights income is not going to Nigeria. It's going to wherever he's registered. And so this becomes an interesting case of where there's certain technologies that could kind of jump a couple of steps. So rather than developing a whole new SAMR, there's the potential to use things like smart contracts as they develop to kind of skip those steps and enable creative industries to formalize in much quicker ways. But in addition to that, I think one of the really interesting things that becomes possible is when you look at the Nigerian creative industries and you look at something like Nollywood. Nollywood is obviously the biggest film industry on the African continent and is the third biggest in the world. But a huge percentage of the distribution of Nollywood films is done pirated. So it's not actually going into the big numbers that we're counting. So even though it's the third biggest by numbers, it might in fact be bigger, we don't know because of the piracy numbers. But that's really interesting because part of Nollywood's model is recognition of piracy and the fact that that enables distribution. So you have a Nigerian model around film that is not the same as, say, an American model around intellectual property. Their model is a different kind of strategy for intellectual property that kind of operates to some degree in sort of open rights, which is in fact something that comes from technology, which is the idea that to some degree you want some of your rights to be open because it can actually enable your product to grow in other ways. And that's really interesting because that also then becomes an opportunity not just to take smart contracts from a company like Ethereum in the States and apply that to Nigeria, but perhaps for Nigeria to take its very specific own intellectual property model and build that into its own smart contracts. Now, that's asking for quite a lot, but at the same time, it's completely doable. With the right kind of imagination and bringing the right kinds of people from both the creative industries and the kind of tech world together to kind of imagine these sorts of things. And interestingly, South Africa is kind of leading in this, and we have Beth in the room to kind of thank for this, who was part of the South African Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which released its report last year, and has specifically identified creative economy as a key part of what they do. And not just creative economy, but also the social economy, so that's your sort of social entrepreneurship, and the circular economy, which is economies really aimed at sustainability, which is really interesting because those are three sort of fields that are still very small in South Africa. We're in the process of developing a bill around social entrepreneurship, but haven't quite completed it, for example. But these are three sort of, again, nascent spaces of economy that have a certain growth that isn't really being looked at yet, as at least from a kind of larger industrial level. And so the inclusion of these areas is also something very interesting in the sense that, again, it's very responsive to kind of access sort of human dignity, equality kinds of questions as well, and looks at economies that are specifically addressing those kinds of issues. So we have at least one example on the African continent that is trying to think about how do you bring these multiple ways of thinking together to enable technologies that potentially respond to the African context. And I end off now with a quote from one of the speakers from our forum in March, Nima Aye, who's from Uganda, and who was saying that the primary question is whether we're going to take up space in this conversation, at least as regards our concerns. Who's making the decisions, who'll be programming the algorithms, and what will be the basis of their decision making. And there's three things there. The one is a question around diversity and the kinds of people who are going into these worlds. And that diversity is a diversity of race and gender, which are conversations that are happening internationally. But it's also a diversity of ways of thinking, kinds of peoples. And who will be programming the algorithms is also an important question, and we delve into the question of ethics quite a lot in the report, but is a real question about how we use data and what data means, and the kinds of trajectories that are emerging from places like the States, which are quite problematic, and the need to kind of address those. But also what will be the basis of their decision making? So this idea of do we operate within this kind of technological future from an African position? Is that our basis? Do we operate from a position of trying to address issues of access and equity, or are we going to try and do something else? So I leave it there as a quick whirlwind of the main findings. I hope I didn't take too long. I think I hand over to you, Lon.
Thank you so much, Malema, for that. Ladies and gentlemen, that's just a snippet of what the research entails. In the next couple of days, we'll be sending you all the research report in which you can more than happy to interrogate, give us feedback, play with it, rip it apart, do whatever you want to do with it. It's a first kind of iteration for us and UJ. It's something that we are looking to check, this kind of relationship between 4IR and creativity coming together and seeing how that relates in the African context. So stay tuned. We will continue doing this kind of work. As mentioned by Peter in his video, next year there will be a fully accredited academic conference. So please, again, stay tuned. Look up social media communication around that. If you're wanting to put in the paper, please submit your papers and all that. There's the team from UJ around the room. They're wearing black jackets with UJ badges if you want to ask more about the conference next year. As I said earlier on, sadly, we're not going to do any Q&As, but please stick around. There's a lot of bubbles and canapes coming out. Let's engage. Let's talk about what 4IR means for the creative industry and the creative economy on the continent. Thank you. Before I end, I need to say my thank yous. On behalf of UJ and Andani.Africa, we would like to thank you first and foremost, all of you guys for, again, beating the cold and coming to join us for this research launch. Also to thank one of our partners, Facebook, who supported us through this program, particularly the forum. Also, I'd like to thank RMB and SOCA Gallery for allowing us to use this incredible venue with amazing views over Johannesburg. And also just a shout out to Michelle for helping us facilitate all of that. Everybody stick around, have bubbles, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Cheers.